I'm going to go ahead with the meeting beginning ritual.
起立，面向佛堂，参加三鞠躬、一鞠躬、再鞠躬、三鞠躬，参加各位点传世一鞠躬，开班一鞠躬，请坐下。Please be seated. 道德经 Chapter 9. So here's how Chapter 9 goes. Holding a cup and overfilling it cannot be as good as stopping short. Pounding a blade and sharpening it cannot be kept for long. Gold and jade fill up the room. No one is able to protect them. Wealth and position bring arrogance and leave disasters upon oneself. When achievement is completed, fame is attained, withdraw oneself. This is the Tao of heaven. Okay, so let me provide some overall remarks before we analyze the structure of this particular chapter. So one thing that I think will stand out is that poetically, if you take a look at line 2 and line 4, line 2 cannot be as good as stopping short is about the overall situation. So it's not talking about a specific container like the cup. But line 4 cannot be kept for long. That's talking specifically about the metaphoric blade. The blade is what cannot be kept for long because it's been sharpened too much. It's become thin and brittle. So in English, there's not very good poetic correspondence grammatically between the two lines, lines 2 and 4. So the fact that this inconsistency shows up illustrates one of the differences between Chinese and English. In Chinese, many things are assumed, many things are contextual. So in Mandarin, line 2 and line 4 still work just fine as poetic lines with poetic correspondence. In English, not so much. So rather than to rewrite those lines and change the translation too much, I decided to keep them that way. So now let's take a look at the meaning and the division between the different sections. So you will notice that we have a structure of A, B, A, B, A, B. That A is a particular situation, doing something too much, and then B is the commentary on that, not as good. So A again, doing something too much, in this case sharpening. B again, about that not being a great idea because the blade cannot be kept for too long. And then A again, something that is too much, filling up a room with gold and jade. And then B again, a commentary on that. No one is able to protect them because you've got too much. So after that, we get into a different structure that is a commentary on the first half of it. So here's what it looks like. So what I've done here is that I've highlighted some characters in red. The first character of 2 and the first character of 4 are the same character. 不, it means no. Now, you would expect that the same character will show up again in line 6, but it doesn't. It's a different character, more. Now, it's still carrying on the poetic structure in the context that this is also a character for negation, just like the character 不. So bu itself can mean is not, cannot, do not. More, same thing, but in a slightly different way. It also means cannot. It can also be used for is not, do not, etc. So it's a different character, but it's a synonym in Mandarin. So we can see that the first 6 lines will form one particular section, just like that. And then the last 5 lines form the second half. Section number 2 is the second half of it. That is basically a commentary on the first half, ending with this is the Tao of heaven. So everything that we're talking about here, examples from daily life, plus how Tao cultivators will apply all the lessons of the first half, will end you up with the Tao of heaven. So that's what we're here to explore today. And we'll do so line by line. So first, holding a cup and overfilling it. If we were to look at the 4 characters of line 1, we would get the following. Literally, first character means to hold. The second character is a connective character, so it can be and, as you see here. Ying, that means full or overfill. And then the last character is a pronoun, it's it. So note that this is hold and overfill it. If you were to do it as a straight transcription, it doesn't say hold what. And that is because it's implied, it's implicit. There's a container that is referring to. It's a vessel, it's a cup, it's a glass, it's a container of water or some sort of liquid, maybe some sort of beverage. It's implied, not explicitly stated. Generally speaking, in the Tao Te Ching overall, you'll find the same kind of brevity and concise expression. And the same is also true for all other literature dating back 2,500 years ago. So the reason for that is the scarcity of medium. So this is back in the days when there was no paper. If you wanted to write something, you find a surface that can take the writing. So in the case of the Tao Te Ching, it was written on bamboo strips or silk. So silk had already been invented, was invented many thousands of years ago. So that could serve as a writing surface. But as you can probably imagine, because it's textiles, only the very wealthy, like nobles, royalty, were in a position to have silk just sitting around that they can use for writing, like we do with paper today. So that being scarce, well, so was bamboo strips that you tie together to form a writing surface. That was also not something that you could easily mass produce. In fact, back in those days, the bamboo strips that were tied together had to be made by hand, of course. But that meant that it was a very slow process. So in order to conserve writing medium, such as silk or bamboo strips, it was important for the ancients to write as economically as possible. That is, attempt to express as much meaning as they could using as few characters as they could. So then we have these 4 character phrases, as we see here, that can have multiple meaning, that can have a lot of things that are implied. And it's only through the supplementary oral tradition that we discover all the additional layers. And later on, when paper became much more widespread, much more commentary was written about these very concise lines. So for that reason, whenever a metaphor is used, it usually comes with multiple layers of meaning. So it's not limited to just a container. By container, I mean like a physical container. You know, could be a pitcher, could be a bottle, could be whatever, could be a bucket. It's not just a container being filled with some kind of liquid. Could be water, could be tea, could be wine, etc. Now, having said that, it's not limited to a container being filled with water, but we can apply it, in that case, to all kinds of different areas in life. So here's one example. Suppose the cup can mean the mind. So your head is the container of things. That's the idea. The tea that it holds will be preconceived notions. So in other words, your mind is a cup, a container, and what's in it are the things that you have learned, things that have been poured into it previously, the knowledge that you have received previously. So what happens when the mind is overflowing with preconceived notions? Well, it just means that there's no room for anything new. So this happens when we see people who are very zealous in guarding some dogmatic ideas, and they're not open to accepting anything else. They won't consider any other possibilities, that their truth will be the only truth. So that is one way to look at this particular line, a cup that is being overfilled, overflowing because of it. So let's explore this metaphor for just a little bit to see all the implications that it has. So remember, we're talking about a cup and tea that you pour into it. Let's explore that. So using this metaphor of a cup holding tea, there is a great tradition in the Tao about this young man visiting an old monk in order to, supposedly in order to learn something new, some wisdom from the old monk. Now, as the young man is conversing with the old monk is asking about what the young man has already learned. So the young man is, very pleased at being asked to express his knowledge, his learning, and he thought greatly of his own level of attainment academically. So he began talking about what he knew, and he got into all kinds of different areas of discussion to display his knowledge. So after a lengthy impromptu lecture from the young man, the old monk suggested that it was time to take tea. So they sat down to have tea, and the old monk set out 2 teacups. So in pouring tea for the young man, the old monk kept going and going and going until the tea is overflowing the cup onto the table, into the young man's lap, who jumped up with a yelp. "Hey, what are you doing?" "Master, no, we're making a mess." And the old monk said, "Well, if your cup is already full, then how can there be room for anything new?" So that is a traditional way of referring to one's mind when one is already full of oneself, not ready to listen to anything new. Even when you make a show of being humble and asking for teaching, in reality, like the young man, what the arrogant person wants to do is to use the opportunity to showcase his or her own level of learning, of knowledge. Okay, so this is a sort of a classic metaphor that's used all the time. in Taoism, in Buddhism, in Buddhist teachings, in Tao philosophy. So we come across this time and again. So for this metaphor, just to be clear, to have tea poured into a cup is to receive knowledge, is to learn knowledge. That's the metaphoric process. That's the metaphor for learning. So what happens after there's tea that's been poured into it? Well, you would sip the tea, you would drink the tea. To sip the tea means to apply the knowledge. You're making use of the tea. What is the tea for? The tea is for drinking. It's for sipping. So to apply the knowledge has the effect of turning knowledge into experience and wisdom. When you apply knowledge in real life, you oftentimes discover that things in the real world are not exactly 100% as described in books. So you have to adjust. You have to modify your approach based on real life circumstance. That gives you valuable experience that you could not have learned from books alone. And this is also what we refer to as wisdom. Wisdom is applied knowledge. Knowledge that's been turned into experience becomes wisdom. So, but what if you don't sip the tea? What if you don't touch the tea? You don't drink the tea at all? If you just let the tea sit there, after a while, it will be cold, stale, or both. So this is analogous to what happens when you learn something a long time ago, and then from that point on, you refuse to take in any updated information. The book knowledge that you have learned from a long time ago, it becomes increasingly outdated as time goes on. So it's like the tea that has gone cold or stale. So that's one way to look at this particular metaphor, the tea accepting water. So here, I would actually make the challenge to everyone much more explicit. So my challenge to everyone is this. As you learn the Tao, as you study the Tao, are you applying the Tao? That is the same as saying, now that you have received tea in your cup, are you actually taking a drink from the cup? Are you actually sipping that tea? Or are you just sitting there staring at it? I find that in the study of the Tao, many people do fall into this trap. That is, they will learn all about the concepts. They understand the idea, they have received the tea, but they won't drink from it. They won't actually apply it to life. But if you don't actually benefit from the tea. So moving on. Let's take a look at a slightly different angle. Visualize, if you will, in your mind, a cup that, like the old monk, pouring tea continuously into it, not stopping at all, a cup that is overflowing. That overflowing cup by itself serves as a metaphor for arrogance, just like the young man in the story. So we know from experience in the real world that if that were to happen in real life, water or tea or some other kind of liquid, maybe juice, maybe soda, whatever overflows the cup, it's going to spill everywhere. It's going to make quite a mess. So combining the first two bullets together, if the overflowing cup is an arrogant person, and the mess that it makes would then be the mess that the arrogant person makes in the world. That is, in a social circle, among friends and family, in groups. Arrogant people mess things up, no matter where they happen to be. So could be the family, could be at the workplace, could be at church, in the community, etc. Messing people up, in this case, is about turning people off. That is, having expressed someone's arrogance, that arrogant person can become what other people don't really want to be around with too much. I'm saying that in sort of an awkward way. So once arrogance comes out, one impact that it immediately has is that it drives people away. Maybe that's the better way to phrase it. So at first, people, when you are with a new group, this is something that I have witnessed myself. When arrogant people come into contact with a new group, initially, we don't really know about this arrogant person. Perhaps the arrogant person has a big title, has a high-level position, and therefore we all think that this person is deserving of respect. So we defer to this person in making decisions. We're much more respectful. We don't really know, we haven't really figured out this person yet. Over time, the truth comes out. Over time, we see through the facade that the high-level position or title, academic titles, certifications, they don't really displace the necessity for actual knowledge, real-world experience and wisdom. So if we find a shortage of that, pretty soon we see through the facade. So I have seen this time and again, that the initial respect for a particular person turns into disdain, even resentment, even disgust. And then people stay away. People don't want to have anything to do with this person who has demonstrated himself or herself as being an arrogant fool. Okay. We're ready now to move on to line 2. So let's cover the first 2 characters first. 不如, 2 characters. The first character means no, no or not. 如, the second character, means similar to or compared to. So together, 不如 means something that cannot be compared to something else, something that is not as good as something else. To not be able to compare it to something means that it's not as good. And so the translation, as you can see here, cannot be as good as something else. And that's the subject we're discussing next. Cannot be as good as stopping short of overfilling something, to overflow something, because then if you can stop in time, you won't be making a mess. So in general, having too much of anything is a bad idea. This is what I meant earlier today when I talked about the synchronistic correspondence that I have in my presentation with Alex's presentation. He spoke of baggage. He spoke of physical and emotional clutter. Well, that's exactly what we're talking about here. To have too much of anything is a bad idea. To stop short of saturation is a better idea. So the idea overall is to do just enough and then not one little bit more. And it's usually the skill in living life usually comes from being able to judge when, at what point is it just right, and you should, never go beyond that point. Anything beyond that will be dangerously close to the saturation point, or will be going right past the saturation point. So this line 2, cannot be as good as stopping short. It's basically telling us that knowledge, preconceived notions, like tea, knowledge is something that you want to learn. You want to receive the tea being poured into your cup, but you want to learn and apply. It's not good enough just to receive the tea. The idea is also to drink from the cup. And the idea also is to remain open, that there's still room in your cup for fresh hot tea, for new ideas, concepts, and updates. And one implication for this is that if you actually apply what you have learned to drink the tea, naturally you end up with room for more things to learn. Like, now that I have applied these concepts, now I really understand them. I have utilized them the way that they're meant to be used. So now I'm ready for the next level of knowledge. That is hot, fresh tea. So, like the first line, this principle applies to all other aspects of life as well. So, example, Chinese people will oftentimes talk about eating and when to stop eating, like, in your regular meals. So it's always a bad idea to fill yourself up until you are at saturation. From experience, you know that this is a very uncomfortable feeling. That's when we say, oh boy, I am so full, I'm ready to burst. Or some people may say, oh man, I'm ready to take a nap. I have so much food. Or people may say, yep, I'm feeling the food coma coming on. So all different ways of expressing how one has overindulged, have eaten too much, have stretched that stomach beyond its limits, way past the saturation point. So what Chinese people prefer to do instead is that they want to stop short of saturation. And in fact, usually people advocate if you can eat until you're 80% full, that's actually a good idea. 80% full. So let's move on and talk about the second metaphor. The first one is about the overfilling cup. The second one is the over-sharpened blade. So line 3, pounding a blade and sharpening it cannot be kept for long. So in this particular context, sharpening a blade, the meaning for sharpening a blade is training yourself in order to show off. So it's a good idea to sharpen your blade. It's a good idea to train yourself. To sharpen your blade means that the blade can be more useful for cutting, which is the purpose of the blade. If you train yourself, it means that you can gain mastery of your physical body. That's the purpose of training. Now you can train yourself mentally as well. So I'm just using physical training as one example from the many that are possible. So it's a good thing to sharpen your blade. It's a good thing to train until you carry it to an extreme, beyond the point of usefulness. When you sharpen the blade too much, it becomes easy to break because it is so thin and brittle. In a similar way, you can overtrain and injure yourself. And this goes back to the idea that we talked about in the previous slide, that too much of anything is a bad idea. So too much of training is a bad idea. you can actually regress instead of progress. For athletes, overtraining can lead to setbacks. So this also applies to other aspects of life. And there's also more than one particular way to see this metaphor. Previously, we talked about how the overflowing cup all by itself can be the metaphor for the arrogant person, the arrogant person whose arrogance makes a mess. In a similar way, a sharp blade that's being displayed, that by itself can be a metaphor as well. Elsewhere in the Tao Te Ching, so this is quite common in Tao teachings, sharpness is used as a metaphor for critical remarks, criticism, harsh judgment. So that sharp blade by itself can be someone who's very critical, who likes to criticize, a critic. So we've all seen people like that too in real life. Nothing's ever good enough for them, you know, and they may put that in nicer ways when describing themselves. Oh, you know, I'm just such a perfectionist, you know, thinking that it's a positive thing. From the Tao perspective, it's actually a very negative thing to be this sharp blade, this blade that is too sharp. The sharp blade, where the sharpness corresponds to criticism, it has a connection with arrogance and the ego and being brutal. So for this particular line, when it says that the sharp blade is easy to break, it cannot be kept for long, it's also in a more subtle way referring to the fragility of the ego of someone who's so arrogant as to be constantly critical of other people. So if you observe others in daily life, then you notice that this is definitely the case. People who are critical, people who are constantly criticizing other people, oftentimes they are putting their arrogance or ego on display, and that ego or arrogance is oftentimes an overcompensation from a lack of security. So when someone pushes back, or when the inadequacy of this person has been exposed or revealed, this person hits the roof. This person will rage and have a meltdown. Why? Because it is a thin blade that is now broken, that cannot be kept for long. It's so thin that it's brittle and it breaks. Like the ego of this person, very fragile. So next time you see someone having a meltdown, take a look. I think that it's very likely you will find the pattern being described here, fitting the pattern from criticism to anger, to being triggered, to melting down. I think you will find that the pattern fits exactly. So let's explore line 4. Cannot be kept for long. So if we break down the characters one by one, we got 4 characters. The first one means no. Second character means can. So no can, cannot. Third character, Tang, means long in terms of distance, in terms of time. The English word long can be used for both. Long duration of time, lengthy time, as well as physical distance, like something being a long, long way off. The Chinese character Tang is used exactly the same way. It has that same dual meaning for physical distance as it does for time. And then the last character, to keep. So no can, long keep, meaning cannot be kept for long. It is something that doesn't last. Here, I need to bring in the concept of something being able to last is something that is congruent to the Tao. So we know the concept of the Tao is the eternal thing, whatever that thing is, the eternal force or principle. The force beyond force, principle beyond principles. The Tao is eternal. So anything that lasts, anything that's long lasting is congruent with the Tao, or in tune with the Tao, or has characteristics in common with the Tao. On the other hand, illusions are impermanent. They don't last. They come and go. Illusions can be maintained for a short time, and then after that, poof, it disappears like a puff of smoke. So illusions never last. This is one of the reasons why when Buddhism came into ancient China, that it found a very easy correspondence with the Tao. In Buddhism, we also talk about life being impermanent, and that indeed the material world is an illusion. That corresponds to this idea here. Illusions never last. So it must not be congruent with the Tao. So it is therefore no accident that the arrogant person, and the metaphor that we used is a cup that is overflowing or a blade that is sharpened to the point of being brittle, easy to break. The arrogant person is not someone who lasts. When I say the arrogant person is not someone who lasts, I am actually referring to a couple of different things here. One is the extent to which this person can last in a particular group. Because people will find out sooner or later, penetrate the veil or see through the illusion of this person being inadequate and not who he or she will, pump up to be, hype up to be, then you can expect that this person will not last too long in the group. That's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is life. Someone who is arrogant is someone who has very few friends, probably no friends at all. So probably someone who lives a lonely, sad, miserable, tragic, and angry life. So that person cannot last because that person at some point no longer has any fun in the business of continuing to live. So why even bother to live another day? These people who live miserable lives, they don't last because there's nothing worth living for. For them, life is lonely and miserable because people are turned off and people stay away. They don't want to have anything to do with that person. The bottom line, at the end of the day, is that community is essential for happiness and longevity. And I would say, even a virtual community like the one that we have, even such a community, I would say that it is essential, at least, from where I'm sitting, it's definitely essential for me for happiness and longevity. So we can ask, how is it that Tao sages seem like such joyous individuals? And indeed, Tao cultivators who are following the true and authentic Tao, they always seem so genuinely happy. Well, how is that? Well, for one thing, these are humble people. These are people who have learned the errors of arrogance, so they're easy to be with. And people naturally are drawn to them. So it is natural for them to have happiness, which leads to longevity. We are now in the third and last metaphor for chapter 9. So in Chinese, 金玉满堂. Let's break it down character by character. 金, this is the Chinese character for gold. Because in ancient China, China had a big influence on the surrounding areas, including Korea and Japan. So Jin became a very common surname for the Koreans. So when you see anyone with the surname Kim, K-I-M, that's actually what that is. If they were to write it out, it's Jin in Mandarin. And then Yu, the second character, means jade. So you can tell that it's this particular character that's 3 horizontal lines, 1 vertical line, plus a dot. So the 3 horizontal lines and 1 vertical line, that character without the dot means king or ruler. The dot signifies what the king is wearing. So the ruler wears jade. Jade is what the ruler wears. That's the meaning behind that particular character. So not all Mandarin characters lend themselves to an easy explanation like that. Some are much more conceptual or abstract, but this particular one, the easy ones, can be seen in sort of a visual way, a pictorial way. Third character, man. This means full. And then the last character, tang, room. So gold and jade, full room. What is that? Gold and jade fill up the room. Or you might say the room is full of gold and jade. Either way, it's depicting a scenario where there's a lot of physical treasures in a particular room. So what does that mean? Having a room that is full of gold and jade, it means having too much or a lot more monetary resources than you can possibly use. So here we have the third metaphor to depict that too much is a bad idea. Having too much is always a bad thing. Why? Well, because in the extreme, it's not the way of moderation. So the arrogance that you saw depicted in the first example, which was the overflowing cup, being filled up with too much water, too much tea, whatever. And the second metaphor, the blade that gets sharpened too much, they all have a similar theme. Too much. Not a good idea. So think about how this is a little bit different, well, actually diametrically different than when we say too much is never enough. So there is a song, that's a line of lyrics from the song, too much is never enough. I want more. Give me more. Too much? No such thing. Too much is not enough. I want even more. So, in a way, this is symptomatic. This is representative of a different mindset between East and West that we we can see manifestations in Western society that compels people to go out and get more. Whereas in Eastern philosophy, we have to instead emphasize the importance of stopping when there is enough. You gotta see when you have enough or even a little bit more than enough, and then that'll be the time to bring everything to a graceful stop. Fortunately, in the West, we're not limited to this particular lack of wisdom. Too much is never enough. In the West, we also have another saying, which goes like, quit while you are ahead. And this recognizes the danger of excess. So the idea of stopping short of 100% is not completely unknown in the West. Or stopping when you have enough or when you have a sufficient quantity. And one thing that I like to point out is that in our stories, in novels, in plays, in TV shows, in movies, we always have the scenario of, come on, just one more job, one more heist. And then something goes horribly wrong, and that generates the drama and the danger and the fall from grace, etc. So the point of the Tao is that you don't want to live a dramatic life. You want to live a life that's simple and peaceful and joyous. When that is the case, you're not going to want just one more or come on, one last job. You want to quit while you are ahead. Okay, let's keep moving. So, what can happen when you have too much? In this case, let's focus on gold and jade, which are representative of physical objects or monetary goods, material things that you can own. Having too much of anything means you become vulnerable or exposed to loss, theft, or damage. So in particular, if you are very attached to your belongings, your possessions, any loss, theft, or damage is going to bother you big time due to the attachment. So misery, sadness can all come from that. Oh, I just lost XYZ. So I want to take a quick moment, to ask everyone to mentally equate a room to a cup, a glass, a container of water. Make it a cup. So imagine that the room was a cup, and imagine that the gold and jade that's being stored in the room as water or tea that's being poured into the cup. So when you have too much gold and jade, more than you can possibly use, that is also the equivalent of when the cup is overflowing with some sort of liquid. So the mess that you make with the spilling of water or tea would then be the equivalent of loss, theft, or damage. So the reason why we have monetary resources, these are good things. Just like when we say training yourself is a good thing, but overtraining yourself can lead to bad things. The second example. For us to obtain monetary resources, that's actually a good thing. That is not a bad thing in the Tao at all. It's a good thing because they're meant to be utilized. You're meant to put them to some sort of use. but people have a tendency to hoard them. That is to say, they see value in the monetary resources, simply as possessions. That is like saying, I want to collect gemstones and jewels because they're so pretty, and I don't want to let go of any of them. And there you can see the beginning of an attachment that can become an obsession. So we hoard them well beyond the point of usefulness. So very important here for me to point out that when we talk about gold and jade fill up a room, just like when we talk about training as a metaphor for sharpening a blade, we're not saying that, well, you should not take any training at all. To sharpen a blade, that's a necessary thing. To train yourself, that's a necessary thing. To have monetary resources, gold and jade, that is also a necessary thing because we live in the material world. So it's about gold and jade filling up the room. It's not about the room being empty of gold and jade. So this is not an advocacy for having nothing. It's not about the room being empty. There's no virtue with having nothing in the Tao. There's great virtue with having just enough to conduct the business that you wish to conduct, to do the things that you wish to do, to give to the charity that you wish to give. There's great virtue in doing all of that. There's no virtue in having too much, and there's no virtue in having nothing. So, hoarding, always a bad idea. Clutter, attachments, everything else. But building up a reserve, building up a nest egg, investing for your retirement, these are all good ideas. And these do not necessarily run into excess. It's not necessarily too much. Okay, one more slide, and then we need to jump to the end. That's good because we are at the very last of the three metaphors. So you probably know this among your friends, the people you know. There are plenty of people in the West living from paycheck to paycheck, a very common problem. In fact, the other day, I saw this joke on the internet, in social media. There's this one person who wrote that after a lifetime of dedicated hard work, being very diligent, I have finally moved on from living from a situation where I was living from paycheck to paycheck. He said, today, I am living from direct deposit to direct deposit. So, same problem. And the problem is, you're spending as much as you make. When you spend as much as you make, there's no opportunity for gold and jade to accumulate in the room. So the room will in fact be empty or have very little. And when there's nothing in the room, no gold and jade in the room, that person is ill-prepared when there's some sort of emergency or unexpected expenditure. And that could cover anything. When we say, that we ought to save for a rainy day, well, occasionally rainy days will occur. Now, the flip side of this is just as bad. It can be the other extreme. That is, people may work hard all their lives, accumulate great wealth, which they then pass on to the next generation. But then the next generation don't have the same mentality to work hard and accumulate. So they are not appreciative, not grateful, and they will waste it away thoughtlessly. That's just as bad. So not enough, too much, they're both absence of virtue. Having just enough would be virtuous. Okay, so that's the last slide of all the different examples in this particular chapter. We can now go to the very end. For this particular summary, I call it the questions inspired by Tao Te Ching chapter 9. So question number 1, which is broken down into 3 questions. Are there areas of excess in your life? And what I mean by that is too much. Are there things in your life that are too much? So right off the bat, you may not think so, which is the reason why I need to delve a little bit deeper and get you to think about the areas of possible excess, possible, quote unquote, too much in your life. Number 2, too much arrogance or self-righteousness, too full of yourself. This may manifest as too much contention or getting into debates. So arrogance, ego, these are difficult topics to cultivate, to work on, to make progress with. However, I would say that at the most basic level, you have to get yourself into a position where, like water, you refrain from contention, like getting into debates. Number 1, too much clutter in your home. This may manifest as what people call creative chaos. When people say creative chaos, they're usually trying to put a nice term on a bad situation. That is, they'll look at the chaotic situation at home and then they'll say, this is what I need in order to be creative. So it's a good indication that they don't really understand how the Tao works. They can be much, much more creative if they were to clear the environment of clutter. So overall, it's a messy environment where you cannot relax. Is that a situation for you? So these are challenges. And the final challenge, are you working too hard and living a life that is out of balance? So this is one manifestation of sharpening your blade too much. It can manifest as constant fatigue, stress, or feeling burnt out. And if that is the case, you probably know what to do to restore that balance a little bit more. You know, to stay away from work, to sharpen your blade less, to give more time to yourself for relaxation, for contemplation, reflection, downtime, time spent with the family, quality time with the spouse. So these are the challenges that I wanted to present to everyone as my summary for today's talk. Let's go ahead and do the meeting ending ritual, everybody. 起立，面向佛堂，持架深鞠躬，一鞠躬，再鞠躬，三鞠躬，持架各位顶传十一鞠躬，斜翻一鞠躬。Well done, everybody. Thank you so much.